This interview is part of the Living Legends collection of the Oklahoma Historical Society. It is an interview with Mrs. Louise Whitham, W-H-I-T-H-A-M, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The interview is by Pendleton Woods. There's no date on the interview. It is being copied for inclusion in the permanent collection of the Oral History Program on March 30th, 1990 by Joel Todd.
This is Penn Woods interviewing for the Oklahoma Living Legends. We are in Tulsa today at the home of Mrs. Louise Morse, that's M-O-R-S-E, Whitham, W-H-I-T-H-A-M. Mrs. Whitham was a retired but long-time teacher in the Tulsa City Schools and played a tremendous leadership role in the early Tulsa Historical Society, and we will be talking with Miss Whitham and find out a little bit about her background. I think to begin with, why don't you tell us who your parents were and where you were born and where you went to school?
Well, I'm a sucker because I was born in Illinois, and my parents were Frank and Ruth Morse, who lived in Tulsa, and my brother was J. Russell Morse, who's a foreign missionary right now. And I am teaching at Central, but I began teaching in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I taught in the Washington State Teachers College before I came to Tulsa. And now, thank you, I'm retired very nicely. Glad to see you.
Where was your schooling? Where did you go to school?
Oh, I have 5 diplomas. The best one, I guess, University of Chicago and the University of Washington. And of course there was a teacher's college and a high school before that.
Was any of your schooling in the territory?
No.
It was all out of state. What do you remember on your first visit to Tulsa?
Well, now, if I were writing a name for that first visit, I think I'd say I watched Tulsa grow up, because that first visit was 1905, but for only 2 weeks. However, Tulsa then was absolutely in its infancy, because you see, that's before statehood. Most of the people, most of the homes, were north of the tracks, the Frisco tracks. But in 1905, there were 3 other railroads into the village. It was a village of probably 1,500 people. And the first thing I was startled about was that our house, instead of facing straight east, faced northeast. And to find out why that was, I had to ask 2 or 3 people. But the story I got finally was that H.C. Hall, who brought the first railroad into Tulsa, asked Chief Legis Perriman, how he wanted the streets south of the railroad track laid out, with the compass or with the railroad track. And Chief Legis said, why, of course, with the railroad track. And so that is why the first streets down to about 7th and 8th are on the slant, and why, later on, the city council straightened the rest of the city plat out.
What were the growth factors in Tulsa between 1905 and 1906?
Well, the biggest thing in 1906 would be the allotment of the land to the Indians. And then, 1907, statehood. That made it possible for white people then to purchase outside of the white man's square mile, which you probably will remember. It's provided in the Treaty of 1865 at the end of the Civil War. That treaty said the Indians would be required to have at least 2 railroad tracks, railroad lines through Oklahoma, and that at each town stop they must provide a square mile in which white people could live without interference.
Can you, swing into your early reminiscences, can you recall any events during your earliest years that were of particular interest, particular reminiscences?
Oh, I walked across the Frisco Railroad track as other people did just for the deviltry of it. It was so much fun to hang on to one of the side posts while the train was going by, and we saved 2 cents by not walking on the regular wagon bridge. A lot of people walked on the railroad bridge rather than on the wagon bridge.
When you came here, who were the leaders in Tulsa that you can recall, civic leaders, names that you remember particularly?
Well, I particularly remember Loyal Martin, who was the mayor. He had been a friend of my father's, and he told me the story of Tulsa's Grand Opera, their first Grand Opera. Now that is the little building that's under controversy right now on 2nd Street. It was built at a time before Tulsa had any paved streets. Mud was way up, hub deep, so he told me. They had a wagon and they raised the money for it by people who passed along the street. He said we could tolerate the mud, but we had to have music. Oh, well, there were a number of other people, very prominent people. John J.M. Hall, the younger brother of H.C., and then, of course, the Mulberries. The Mulberries were the Methodist minister's family, and his 2 daughters were teachers in the Methodist free school, and his son George, who became later important in the water department, was one of my best authorities for very early history.
Can you describe the streets at that time?
Well, of course, there's just no street paving. The streets, as early as 1905, the sidewalks were made out of plank, and there was a bridge across Cat Creek. Now that's where the Frisco Railroad track now runs. That was quite a creek, too, and they definitely needed a bridge. And then along the street you'd see the hitching posts and that sort of thing.
Why did you become a Tulsa citizen in 1918?
Well, I came here again in 1915. I had been teaching in Washington, as I have told you, at a salary of what was then considered quite good out there, about $1,200 a year. And I found when I came to Tulsa that in the period between 1905 and 1915, there had been a most astonishing growth. There was, and the high school teachers were paid $1,800. No, I beg your pardon, $1,500 when I first came. I did get $300 the next year. And that was a factor. And then another thing, in my teaching position in Washington, so many young people were going to the war, or girls were getting positions in business, factories and whatnot, that it cut the enrollment of the State Teachers College way, way down. And it just seemed to me that it was time for me to make the move, which I'm glad I did. Mr. Overholser was superintendent at that time. He was a very progressive and wise man. And then Merle Prunty was the first principal that I had encountered here in Tulsa. and he is the most important person in the development of the Tulsa public schools.
What was school teaching like at that time compared with today? What were some of the problems different?
The constant influx of people into Tulsa, the school board could never keep up to equip schools sufficient for the large number of students that came. I can recall very vividly one high school experience when, and this was before Will Rogers and Webster were built, that my classroom, 236, was equipped for 25 people, but by putting chairs in around the sides and between the aisles, they crowded in 50. I also remember how Jack Gott, who is now quite well known as the referee of our wrestling matches, happened to get a seat right next to the door. And in the midst of a rather serious discussion, I saw from the corner of my eye that he just slipped out. The boy next to my desk leaned over and said, "Jack Gott's up and got." And I said, "But there's still 50 of us left here." So there were problems like that. And then you see there were so many people. There were boys coming back from the war, and there were people who had graduated and couldn't go to school anywhere else. We took them in as sort of just giving them work that they hadn't been able to get before, but it crowded the school. Well, eventually, of course, Will Rogers and then Webster were built.
What was the comparative size when you came here of Tulsa and Sapulpa? I understood that in early days Sapulpa was larger.
Oh, definitely. Tulsa was had the recording office for all northeast Oklahoma under the original territory setup. And then, too, the Frisco Railroad had extended its repair shops. The turnaround business was at Sapulpa. And so for years and years, Sapulpa was a much larger town. At one time, Red Fork was larger, they tell me, but I don't know anything about that.
What was the most, how was Tulsa affected by World War I?
Well, at first, it was a sort of a drain, and yet, on the other hand, it was a wonderfully unifying thing. We all worked so hard to do things that would help and boost the war, because all of the men who had gone because they wanted to. They weren't waiting for a draft. There were so many things that women folk could do. We got acquainted in a way that we had never been able to do before. And at the end of World War I, there was that terrible flu where everybody went around wearing masks and where we were just literally afraid. The hospitals were so full and workers were so hard to get that even the school teachers took their turns helping. I know I was asked once to go as a cook, but I'm not very much of a cook, so I folded some bandages.
What is the most difficult school problem?
Well, necessarily with that very rapid influx. Now, for instance, from 1905, that 10-year period, to 1915, Tulsa had grown about 3 times its original size, and it's always kept up with it. That's always been the problem of the Tulsa public schools, is to get housing for the large number of students that come.
What were the term Tulsa the Beautiful of 1920? Where did that come from?
Well, there's a book which was put out called Tulsa the Beautiful, but I think it well merited it, because that was the year when there was so many beautiful houses were built, and when our downtown, the old downtown, with its beautiful towers, the paving, the whole thing, the size of the city, the complete cleanliness of it, and the friendliness of it. Walk down Main Street and you just meet people that met you as happily and friendly as good Southerners always do. And everybody took such pride in it. We were sure that we were going to have, that we were making a beautiful city. And so the book, Tulsa the Beautiful, has a good title.
How did the 1929 crash and depression affect you and the other Tulsans?
I think the first 2 years, it didn't hurt quite as much as it did later on. But it was a shock to know what it did to the storekeepers and the big business people. Actually, in the first 2 years, it hurt the people who had ventured most. During that period, for instance, Mrs. Lindsay, who was so important in the growth of Tulsa that when she died, the newspapers headed it, "The Mother of Tulsa is Dying." She lost practically everything she owned, even her home. There were men who jumped off the hotel roofs. That part of it was a terrible shock. And then, of course, we became accustomed to the tremendous buying power of the dollar. We could buy eggs for 5 cents a dozen. We could get Mrs. Smith's lovely bread, 3 for a quarter. And there were problems of that sort. I've seen youngsters in school who hadn't had any breakfast. And one case I know of a person who fainted because they literally hadn't had enough to eat. So, and the hospitals were just so crowded, so difficult to get nurses to take care of them at that time. It was a period of great retrenchment, and it lasted for nearly 10 years.
Backtracking just a little bit, when were you married?
Well, when was I married? 23, I think.
1923, and your husband's name was?
John Whitham.
John Whitham. What was his business?
He was a lawyer.
He was a lawyer.
I should say attorney. In Seattle, by the way. Well, the Depression meant this to our little family. It meant that because one of the men in the family had been drowned, leaving a little daughter with her child, and the Depression cut everybody's income. John and I met that as grown-ups, and I came back to Tulsa to teach. I had a period in the 20s rather, when I was in Seattle, of course. And it was a companionship and a growth companionship. He died in 52.
What is meant by the progressive method of teaching?
Well, now that was something that came in at the time Dr. Mason became the superintendent. It was originated among teachers and educators in the East. It meant practically that instead of depending wholly upon memory and getting your message out of a book, you would learn by doing, as in fact most of us do whether we're in school or not. And the idea is that it not only developed memory, but it developed personality, because the initiative that the student would have to have in order to acquire information or to work out some problem was a developing process. And that is really the reason why I was asked to take charge of the Tulsa group to really study and write a Tulsa history. They said to me, Our pioneers are still living here in Tulsa. Go out and get their story. We want a Tulsa history. Now that, when they first laid that burden on my shoulders, that was 37. The idea was that we were to do the first semester a basic history of Oklahoma history, which was required by law and which would give them a university credit, application credit, and then in the meantime to get acquainted with the town and to write this history or to write phases of it in the second semester. I have thought sometimes that this thing of letting the young people decide what they want to do and to go the way they want to go might be partly responsible for some of that overplus in self-initiative that we're now seeing in university people. But maybe I'm wrong. Well, that's the progressive method. Now then, the problem of applying it to the Tulsa Historical Society class that I had, I talked it over with the young people, and we got into our Tulsa history, Oklahoma history pretty well, all the time thinking about what we were going to do in the second semester. The people of Tulsa were perfectly delighted that this sort of thing was at last going to get on paper. And during that first semester, we had many telephone calls about what they had, and they'd be so glad to see us. And at that time, the Tulsa World and the Tribune, the leading papers, were finding it very, very difficult to get material. There was a sort of a breathless deadness that came through because of the Depression. And reporters would come to me, "Oh, Mrs. Whitham, please do something. I can't find anything to write about." So for that reason, we had a lot of publicity. In the second semester, where we made these calls, we published articles in the newspapers. I have some here. And one series particularly of 20 numbers. Each one featured a visit to a family, and they were being interviewed, a good deal like I am now. And then those two students that were with me worked with me in writing up our memories of the visit. Well, that turned up, of course, some very interesting Tulsa history. Mrs. Clinton, who was a very good friend of mine, told about the times that we used to have moonlight excursions on a steamer that they could board here in Tulsa, which would go up as far as the confluence of the Red Fork and the Arkansas. There was dancing aboard, there was refreshments, and a real spirit of jollity, which they appreciated very much. Then there was another one that told about the building of a boat, which was launched here on Tulsa River. We have to remember that the Arkansas then was a flood as compared to the dribble it is today, because that was before the irrigation up in Colorado had taken out so much of the river, and when the rainfall was greater.
Did you ever visit the Bears and Glen's, or could you talk about that one?
Well, now that is famous because it's in Washington Irving's story of his trip through this part of the country. Famous also because James Gardner, geologist and historian, used to take tours, just people for the sheer pleasure of sharing with them his enthusiasm for Washington Irving's stories. When he took one of our Tulsa historical group with him, he said that he wanted to make it a longer learning trip for our benefit. And so instead of going the short way to the Bears Glen, he took us first across the river. And as we came to the hill, which is approximately where the Osteopath Hospital now is, it gives a good view of the area. And as a geologist, he told us that he knew that the hill on which we were looking, and then Riverside Drive, which is like another bench, another hill just below that one, had also, in past time, a still smaller parallel hill, and that the Arkansas River, in its flood periods when the Great Ice Age was melting, and when the Arkansas River was a vast rushing torrent, that third hill had been worn down and smoothed down, just as a stone is smoothed when it's in a tumbler. And that had given a rock bottom to the Tulsa River, the Arkansas River at this time. He pointed out the bridge, which we were shortly to cross, and said that it would have been impossible to have that bridge there without that rock bottom. That it began, the little old hill, which now is the rock bottom of the river, began north of the Arkansas Bridge, Frisco Bridge, and it went nearly a mile south to a point shortly below, that is south of, the Midland Valley Bridge. And somebody said, not to the 51st Street Bridge? No. When that was built, it was necessary to dig way down and to get caissons planted on a bottom which they found many feet below the rock bottom that we are now talking about. And then he said, now let's just suppose that that rock bottom had been 10 miles south instead of where it is. What difference would that make to Tulsa? And of course somebody spoke up, well, a Frisco Bridge wouldn't be here. And another one said, and that one wouldn't be there. And another one said, well, the people wouldn't have been fording the river the way they were. I guess Tulsa just wouldn't have been here, which is certainly true, because one of the very important things in the history of Tulsa really is the rock bottom of the river at this point.
How were you able to locate Confederate graves?
Well, before I tell you that, I think I should tell you just a little more about Mr. Gardner.
All right.
Now, we crossed the river and we looked at and talked about the rock bottom, but the point he wanted us to see was nearly where old Fort Arbuckle was. Now that would be about Keystone. There's a great outlook there. It's out beyond our city park. And he said before any Indians came here in 1836, that had been built by the government to protect the Indians in case they needed it from the Plains Indians. And then within a year or so, it was abandoned as Arbuckle number 2 was built further south. But the buildings were left there so that they could be used, if it was necessary, in the case of attack. They'd quickly be reactivated. And then later on, Mr. Gardner wrote an article about that in the Chronicles, and our Tulsa Historical Society has a monument out there to mark the place. Then we went on from there to a point where we could look out at the confluence of the Red Fork, we call it Cimarron now, and the Arkansas, and he said, I think this is the most beautiful picture that I know of in Oklahoma, and someday I'm going to have Frank von der Laken paint that for me. And he did. And then we went from there to, it would be about on present Highway 51, and we reached what Irving called the Bear's Glen. Well, it's quite a beautiful description in the Tour on the Prairies. And we could still see places on the trees and stumps where the bears had clawed. We could still see the holes in the rock formation of that glen, which had been their den. And so we just thought about the animals that at one time had been here but had to give way to the white man. And then to get home, we came back on Highway 51, and he explained to us that was called the old Dawson Road because that was the way that the first road was explored. Stumps where the bears had clawed. We could still see the holes in the rock formation of that glen, which had been their den. And so we just thought about the animals that at one time had been here but had to give way to the white man. And then to get home, we came back on Highway 51, and he explained to us that was called the old Dawson Road because that was the way that the first road was explored from Fort Gibson west. It did not come through what we then called Tulsa. 51, you know, is a little north of the hill. And but again, that was one of his teaching points. Gardner was a very wonderful man.
You mentioned in this, on your tours, the Friends Hillside Mission.
Yes, you probably remember that the Friends Society, we call them Quakers, you know, they asked the government to appoint men from their organization who would take care, who would be the first agents of the Indians as they came west and established agencies. This was after the Civil War. The attitude of friendliness and understanding and help that the Quaker Society was able to give to people was also extended to the Indians who had to live on reservations, and that was so hard for them. Well, now, one of the men who was so appointed was Agent Miles, and he happened to be the uncle by marriage of the little orphan boy, which we know as Herbert Hoover. Now, we found out about the story I want to tell you there because after the Depression, we had what was known as the Writers' Project, in which the stories of the older people here in Oklahoma were solicited, a good deal as we're now doing by tape. In those days, by written interviews. And then after the period of depression had finished, the collected information was put and published in a book which we happen to have in our little library. One of the projects we had given to young people was to scout around and find out things that would be of interest to our work, our study. And so one of the boys found the account of a man who said that he had been a storekeeper in Pawhuska at that period, and that Mr. Miles, Agent Miles, was caring for a little orphan boy, the nephew of Mrs. Miles. And he said, and you know, if I'd ever thought that that little fat boy was going to be President Herbert Hoover, I'd have paid more attention to him. Well, that struck us all as something that we wanted to investigate. Had a president of the United States really lived a while in Indian Territory? Back east, you'll see George Washington slept here and whatnot, you know. So, again, we went to find out about it. We looked in the biographies of Mr. Hoover and the things that had been written about him, and there was no mention at all of his having been in Indian Territory. So our next project was to write Mr. Hoover and verify this story. And we wrote to him about all the stories that we had collected about him through this writer's project. And Mr. Hoover was very much amused and very nice. He wrote 3 different letters to us. They're now in Oklahoma Historical Society, by the way, and have been published in the Chronicles. And in one of them he said, I think there was some embroidery done on those stories. I don't remember all that reading, but he said, what I wanted to learn how to speak Osage. And I wanted to make a bow and arrow like the little Indian boys did. And I believe I could do it if I had the same kind of wood today that they had up there at that time. Well, that led to an interesting acquaintance on my part. I visited or saw Mr. Hoover 3 different times during his lifetime, and he honored me by giving me volume 1 of his autobiography, in which he does tell the story of his having been at Pawhuska. And I know in one of his letters he said, I just wish I could have a whiff of that good Oklahoma air. I have to go up to 36 stories here in the Waldorf Astoria to escape what there is down on the street in the way of air.
One thing I believe, did you mention the locating of Confederate graves?
Well, that, of course, is a major story, a major accomplishment, I think, of the Historical Society. Now, it occupied 5 different yearly groups, and it started out purely by accident. Mr. Foster, who was the principal of the high school, called me one afternoon to say that a man was here that he'd like me to talk with when the school was dismissed. Well, it turned out that the visitor was a salesman for a rare book collection or a bookshop somewhere in the East. And what he had brought for our consideration was Volume 8 of the War of the Rebellion. Now, Volume 8 has to do with the Confederate soldiers' official records, which are in Washington. They've been collected and published, and there are other volumes that give the federal story. But this Volume 8, which we could have for $25, and which I bought, tells the entire Apostleahola campaign. Now, Apostleahola was a man who did not wish to go with the Confederate armies during the Civil War. His argument was that it was the white man's war and not the Indians' war, that if, in any case, if if the North won, the Indians in Oklahoma would have broken their treaties with the United States, and they would then be in the uncomfortable position of people who were defeated. Well, at least in that book, Colonel Cooper, who later on became Major General Cooper in the Confederate Army, tells the story. Now, we don't get it from the Federal side, but he does mention Tulsa Town, spelling it Tulsey, Town, Tulsa Town, several times. He does tell about a Western battle, probably battle number 1, which is shortly to be marked by our present Tulsa Historical Society. And the description was so complete with regard to the battle on Bird Creek, which is the second one in the campaign, that it was just irresistible to our young people. Now that is something we can do. And of course, the problem of financing came up. Well, already we had developed a postcard system and sold them around town for 5 cents a piece. And it's amazing to me how quickly the townspeople backed this movement of, first of all, finding out where the 15 Confederate soldiers were buried, and then second, more about the war as a whole. Now, there were prominent people who had made careful studies of that war situation who helped us. I remember Dean Trickett and Tom Mayer, and Angie DeBow, the historian, was interested with it. The Tulsa County Engineering Forces were very helpful too. They came out there and measured exactly where the Confederate graves were found, and they are a matter of record in the Tulsa Engineering records here in Tulsa, County Courthouse. John Tyner was an older Cherokee citizen, and his house and the corn crib and things like that, which are described in the battle story, were very close to the actual burial site of these 15 soldiers. John Tyner, as a boy, had been told by older men, "Now we helped bury these soldiers, and someday men will come who will want to know where they are buried. So you young boys, you will please remember." And they charged them again and again, remember where they were buried. And he looked up at us with tears in his eyes and said, "And at last you have come." Well, he pointed out the stone, the little stone that he had buried, one at the head and one at the foot of that long trench. And it was covered over with grass, but it was still could be located. The stone which we finally erected there was cut from a quarry in Alabama to the dimensions which we had planned. It's granite from Georgia, and a bit of the old beloved country of the Indians. Their ancestors had lived there, and that's the one that marks that grave today. So, that's that story, except this. In the book, the man from Texas reported the death of 2 men from Fort Worth, and there was just 2 asterisks in the book without giving the names of the 2 soldiers who were buried in that group of 15. So our historical society wrote to Fort Worth, and it was published in the paper, a request. If anybody had a kinsman who had died in that war, we'd like to know about it. But no answer came until the day that the monument was uncovered. And then a woman came up to me and said, "I'm from Fort Worth, and I want to know the names of those two soldiers that you wrote about." And I said, "Well, we wrote that article hoping we'd find out." And she was so desperately disappointed because her brother had left Fort Worth with the other Texas people who came up here, and they'd never heard from him again. And so she looked at that grave and she said, "Well, maybe he's there."
What was the controversy about the first Tulsa post office?
Well, that was there was a postal delivery at the Perriman home, years and years before the Star Route left the mail, United States mail, at the Perriman home. Now that was partly because Perrimans were very generous people, and they did as all pioneers do. They'd bring mail in anytime they came to a point where it would be delivered, so I think undoubtedly there was an unofficial postal delivery at the Perriman home before the United States Star Route was established. And that, you see, would be 78, while the other one might have been about the Civil War period. But we do definitely know that the Perriman home was the place where the first official United States Post Office mail was left. There's been a good deal of writing about that and study.
What about the oil paintings that the society bought for Central High?
Well, we were much impressed by the work of A.C. Blue Eagle. Now, he's been dead for 10 or 15 years, but he was a very brilliant painter and a man of great personal charm, and so we were able to buy one from him, and we've left them in Central High, and with a proper label on the back of the painting, which would tell when it was bought and the author and things like that. I think A.C. Blue Eagle was one of the most interesting Indian persons that I've ever known, because for one thing he capitalized on the fact that he was an Indian. He was a graduate of Oklahoma University, but he had an extensive and successful lecture tour in Europe as well as in the United States. I heard him one time tell most of the story, and he was dressed as an Indian might have been dressed. Perfectly magnificent physical piece of humanity. He told about as a little boy, he had to go to a white man's school, and he got so lonesome, so afraid, and he wanted to get home. He found 2 or 3 other little boys that also wanted to get home, so they ran away. He got home and spent one night with his kinfolk, and he decided he'd just never go back again. He didn't care whether he was going to learn to read and write or not. But then at noon, as they were gathered around the table, they heard the men coming, and his grandmother said, "Under the table." So he told how he had crouched there under the table. He went over to his grandmother, and she put her apron over him, and he said he could feel the knees of all his kinfolk, and he loved them, so he just hated, and they dreaded to hear the men coming up the walk to get him. But they saw the empty plate and chair, and they knew that the little boy was there all right. And so he said, "I was dragged away to become the painter and what I am today." And it was so pathetic. We just felt a little bit closer to the famous artist who had told us about that. Then the von der Laken pictures, Now, one of them is about the battlefield itself, and the important point of that is that it shows the trench. Now, it's peculiar. There's just a natural trench where most of that fighting was done, and where, incidentally, Colonel McIntosh was the man who commanded the group that held the trench against the other assaults, really practically turned the day in favor of the Confederates.
What about this booklet that you have? Tell us what it is.
Well, yeah, that's it. I think I'm most proud of that as a single accomplishment of the historical people than anything else. In the first place, one of our boys kept scouting the second-hand bookstores, telling them that he would buy whatever was necessary, whatever they found that would apply to early Tulsa history. And so he came in one day with this rather tattered, almost dirty little pamphlet, but it's the treaty between the Cherokees and the United States government at the end of '65, the war, and it's done, you see, in the Cherokee Strip, the Sequoia Strip. Well, we also had in our files, we had something that Ralph Lamb had given. There are three of them. Is it all?
You want to go from there? Oh.
Yeah.
What?
Page, I'll go on. We also had a leaflet which had been sent to us by Reverend Lamb. It gave John 3:16 in English, and then the same thing, in the Creek language, and in the Cherokee language, and in the
Okay. Go ahead. What you were talking about, John.
In this little book, our young people had gathered the story of the translations of John 3:16 into the Creek language and the Cherokee language, done by Sequoia himself, and then pictures of Sequoia and a story of his life, and then at the end, of course, this one that came from the government. They bound it nicely, and I think that it's a credit to any group of high school people.
What honors came to the Historical Society?
Well, we were asked to write a great many things for different magazines and papers, and the Eastern papers picked it up, the Texas papers picked it up, so we were quoted again and again, and the Chamber of Commerce in Tulsa gave a citation of merit to the work that they were doing. Eventually, of course, the high schools were also teaching the group, teaching the history of Tulsa. And but the best thing out of it, I think, was the personality development that came from the young people doing something that they wanted to do and feeling that they had accomplished a thing that was a credit to the school and which would be a help to future people. And I do want to tell you that so far as I know, there is no member of that group which has disgraced the city and many, many that have been a very great credit to it.
How did you continue that in 1950?
Well, Mrs. Doherty, who had been a sixth grade teacher, replaced me when in 1950 I left the system, and then because so much historical material had been gathered together, their emphasis was on citizenship and the practical application of citizenship, and they won an honor for that reason. Then the city of Tulsa, the public schools of Tulsa, decided to put the teaching of Tulsa history proper into the sixth grades and of state history into the ninth grade, so that there was no more work for the society as a whole. But our books and pictures, the things that we had collected, were stored in a closet down there at Central High School. And in '65, Mr. Black, who was then president of the present Tulsa Historical Society, brought all of those to a storage room, and they are shortly to become the property to be given to the Tulsa Historical Society, Tulsa County Historical Society. And so the work goes on, and many of the young people who were in the original group are now interested in the further development of the study of history and are themselves a credit to the town as a whole, and I thank you.
Did you ever see your former pupils, any of your
Oh, yes, indeed. I do indeed. Avery Coburn, the boy that brought the post boxes from the Perriman home to the high school, has for the last 25 years been with the U.S. Engineers. And John Lufbro, who was the first president, is now a big man with the Scully Oil Company. And Roy Brown, another president, runs the biggest grocery down at Bixby. Well, I could just go on a list of people like that. I'm just proud that accident made it possible for me to be the advisor and helper of the society at the time when I was that honored.
Yes, I think it's maybe a little more than accident. Maybe someone willed that it be that way, because certainly you have started and developed a great thing. And in all honesty, I can say this has been one of the most pleasurable interviews I've ever made. This is Penn Woods in Tulsa, closing an interview with Mrs. Whitham.